What was it like? Sailing on Titanic, the pride of the White Star Fleet, largest ship in the world. One of the best, worst, most glorious and most horrifying experiences of my life. Certainly one which none of us aboard will ever forget. I think it would be best if I was to start at the beginning. I'd overheard talk of this amazing new vessel the year before in one of my Aunt Emma's fashionable clubs in Southampton, and I just knew I had to be a part of it. I managed, after much pestering, to convince Father to pay for tickets for myself and my travelling companion, Ruby. I wished to visit my cousin Julian, who had emigrated to New York to begin his own publishing business there. Goodness knows why, when he had barely even so much as glanced at a book while we were growing up. My ticket was, of course, for first class, but clearly not wishing to be too generous, Ruby was to travel in third. Oh, I can see you look shocked. There would be plenty of opportunity for me to make the acquaintance of suitable people on board, so I should not be alone during the week's voyage, and prey to the improper attentions of any male passengers. Chance would be a fine thing. Oh, but you should have seen her at the quayside in Southampton, the most enormous vessel anyone had ever seen, a true floating palace. Once myself and Ruby had found our way through the crowds and said our final goodbyes, she made her way towards one of the third-class entrances at the rear of the ship, as I made for mine at the middle. We were only due to meet again on the pier in New York. Finally aboard, a steward led me to my stateroom. Well, what a sight awaited me when that door was opened. The room was absolutely enormous, with such beautiful furniture and fittings, the cot bed made of mahogany, if you please, and all of the wonderful wood panelling around the walls. On trying to find my way out, I actually walked straight into a cupboard by mistake. After we left Southampton on the 10th of April, we called at Cherbourg in France and then Queenstown in Ireland to collect more passengers and mail before finally heading out into the open ocean. Well, the luxury of this ship, I'm sure I don't need to tell you. The exquisite grand staircase, it swept down as gracefully as a waterfall, with the great clock on the landing. Then there was the extremely elegant smoking room for the men, no women allowed, of course, and the reading room for the ladies. There was also a Turkish bath, a gymnasium, and a swimming pool. The Turkish bath was the most lavish affair. Richly coloured tiles, gilded decorations, and bronzed lamps around the walls. There was a steam room, a shampooing room, and even an electric bath, which sounded vaguely terrifying. To be honest, I never actually used this room, but I was assured it was quite an unpleasant experience. And so to Sunday the 14th. So to Sunday. I awoke feeling rather unwell with an awful headache, so I decided to take a trip up to the boat deck to get some sea air. I remember feeling rather cross that my view was blocked by all of the lifeboats. If only that had been the worst of it. Well, luckily, I began to feel better, and by the time evening came around, I was quite ready for the 10-course meal. After this, a number of us retired into the lounge for a game of cards. Now, it was very pleasant, but at a little before 11 o'clock, I suddenly felt strangely cold, and I wanted nothing more than to return to my cabin. Oh, with all the thoughts of the day swirling around in my head, I must have dropped off to sleep with the lamp still on, for the next thing I knew, I heard an enormous knock on the door. It was a steward, who calmly asked me to report to the boat deck wearing warm clothes and my life jacket. Well, feeling rather confused, I glanced at the clock. It was midnight. Well, I thought nothing could be seriously wrong. I mean, I would have felt something, surely. I popped my head out into the corridor and straight away saw a number of others walking the halls wearing their life jackets, so I went back inside and did the same. I left my room. I passed the forward first-class entrance, where the full ship's orchestra was playing such cheerful tunes, and out onto the boat deck. Everywhere was terror and chaos. Nobody knew what to do. And where was Ruby? I tried to search. I ran along that deck, praying with all my might she had made it up safely, when from out of nowhere I was grabbed roughly by the arm and practically hurled into a lifeboat. There were a number of us there, but not many, not full, when a sudden jolt signaled our descent towards the sea. As soon as we were released from the lines, the sailors on board began to row with all of their strength, and we slowly but surely began to move away. The night was crystal clear and so cold. I don't think I shall ever forget the sound of screaming as long as I live, or what seemed like a terrible explosion before her lights flickered and went out. She slid slowly out of sight forever, and then the terrible silence. Ruby? No. I searched the Carpathia, the rescue vessel, high and low, but so there you are. The best and worst experience of my life. We will never forget it.